Hey guys, got a nice instructive game to share with you today that features one very important attacking tactic that you need to know. So I was just on chess.com and one of my friends, Craig Wilson 90, popped up with a challenge for a 30-minute game. So I accepted and here we are. We've got a 30-minute game. Craig starts with the white pieces and he plays e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, which is the Petrov. So there's an opportunity here for him to grab the pawn, but he declines that and instead plays d3. One issue with this is obviously it's potentially blocking in this light squared bishop. I bring out my bishop to c5, targeting the weak f2 square, and we have h3, then preventing my knight from coming into g4. Okay, so maybe it's an unnecessary pawn move. Another alternative to prevent this is to develop the bishop, and then should the knight come in, you can then castle, and the rook will then be defending that square as well as the king, so you should be all right there. So this is a pawn move that maybe doesn't have to be played. So knight to c6, and now the bishop comes out, and now I play d5. So my pawn here is defended by knight and queen, and attacked only once by the e4 pawn. So we have knight now comes out to c3, but clearly this, to me, is shouting out for a kick, because I already have this pawn on d5, which is under some pressure. So I simply push the pawn now to d4, so I've gained space, but more importantly, this knight now has to go somewhere. Now, so Craig's rated between 750 and 800, okay? So the move that he plays is knight to a4. However, there is an issue with this move, because if you look at it, this square here is under attack by the pawn, all right? So he moves here, but where can this knight go? Because he can't go to this square now, he can't go to that square. Currently, the only square that he could go to is c5. Now, what I simply do is I drop my bishop back, and now if you look at it, this knight has no safe squares at all. So what he's done is he's moved his knight into a position where it could find itself easily trapped. So Craig now castles. So what I'm thinking about is, okay, well I could have ideas of maybe bishop to d7, then push a pawn, or even queen to d7 and attack the knight that way. But then I thought, he's got a he can defend. So if I attack the knight with bishop or queen, let's say bishop, he can simply push b2 and defend the knight. Then if I capture, pawn captures, and yes, he's doubled up his pawns, but materially we're still equal. So I figure, so I line this up with that idea in mind, but then I realize actually that that's not going to work. So now we have bishop out to g5, pinning the knight against the queen, but that's not a pressing emergency. So I figure b5, now attack the knight with a pawn, and then even if he does play this, then I've won a knight for a pawn, and that's much better. So the knight comes out, I grab the knight, pawn recaptures. So I'm up a knight for a pawn at this point in time. So now it's time to kick the bishop. Bishop retreats, kick again with g5. So here in this game, I'm leaving my king in the middle of the board. But the reason is because I've got the initiative. I've already got a material advantage. White has declared his intentions. He's castled kingside. So I'm figuring that maybe it's just time to attack. So now I bring my knight into h5, potentially attacking the bishop one more time. Bishop retreats, and now I move my knight into f4. Lovely square for the knight there. If we have pawn pushes, for example, I might be able to get in knight captures h3 check, but then my knight could find itself trapped with nowhere to go as well. So in actual fact, that doesn't happen because we have bishop takes knight, and now I capture with the g pawn. And the reason for that is I want to open up this lovely semi-open file towards white's king. All right, white doesn't really want to allow that to happen. So I think the bishop takes here was not the ideal move. Anyway, so now we have rook to b1, threatening a pawn. I just push a6 and defend. And now we have another pawn push, but I'm now lining up my idea. Now, can you see the tactic here? Okay, so what I'm actually attacking here is the pawn on h3. I've got a bishop looking at that pawn, because the defender of the pawn is this pawn on g2, and with my rook here on g8, that pawn is actually pinned. So this is a very, very common pattern that you will see. Now, my opponent, I think, missed the threat and just pushed the pawn to attack the knight. I simply moved the knight back to e7, and now we have another pawn push. So he's striking up for space on the queen side, but this is no problem for me. This pawn, if it advances, it would be attacking my bishop, but it'd be undefended on that square, so I don't have to worry. So now I dive in and snatch the h3 pawn, and now we have rook to b3, but then now we're going to enter into a sequence of very uncomfortable captures. Okay, so I grab the pawn first on g2. So now the bishop is in the way, my bishop is in the way of the king being in check. And clearly I'm threatening this rook here. So the rook moves, and now we get into this potentially very devastating sequence or pattern that's called the seesaw. And the seesaw involves moving a piece with a discovered check on the king. Okay, so there's a few patterns. It's actually very common if you can get two rooks on the 7th rank and like a bishop, where you can have the king having to move backwards and forwards in the corner. So rook checks the king, king has to move, rook moves and captures a piece with a discovered check from the bishop, and then you can go backwards and forwards and you can clean up the whole 7th rank with your rook doing that. And this is kind of similar, but it's the other way around. So we've got a rook now that's delivering check and a bishop that is grabbing material. So the bishop captures the knight. Okay, now white can't recapture because the king's in check from the rook. So where's the king going to go? Right, can't go here, can't go there. So we've got two squares to go to. And clearly he doesn't like the look of h2. Right, so the king now moves to f1. And now what we do is we simply repeat. Okay, bishop to g2 check, and the king only has one square. Right, back to g1. Now the bishop grabs a pawn and the king's in check, and the king moves back to f1, and we do it again. Check with the bishop, king moves back, grab another pawn, right? King moves back. What do? Check one more time. Now the king moves back. Now I've got nothing else to capture, so I've eaten everything on this light square diagonal. So now it's time to increase the pressure. So I move my knight away from e7 so that my queen can come in, maybe queen to h4, and then queen to h1 would be checkmate. And now this is a blunder on white's part, right? Because what's he done here is offered up another piece on this diagonal of death. So I capture the bishop now with another discovered check from the rook and attacking the queen. So king moves, I grab the queen for a bishop. Happy days. Now, right now the queen comes in, and now we're starting to attack. Okay, so queen comes in to g1 check. There's only one square really for the king, and now we have a check with the pawn. The king grabs, check, and now a fork on the king and the rook. This rook can capture, but it's going to get recaptured by a pawn. There we go. And now pawn comes out, and again white blocks with a piece, but the piece that's a square that's under attack by a pawn, so loses the rook and then resigns. So instructive game, I think, and really what I wanted to show you was that idea of the seesaw, and particularly that you can repeat. It's okay sometimes to repeat a position. Right, if you've got your opponent on the ropes, just keep going at that. But yeah, check out the seesaw attack as well. if you can, maybe I'll try and do an example of it using the bishop delivering check and then the rook as well. So we'll try and get a video on that in the near future. But just want to remember, okay? Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. See you soon.